We're here in what I refer to as the historical quarter of Lisnaskea. We're in Castle Balfour. And over to my left we have Balfour Castle, which was built around 1618 by James Balfour during a plantation period as a stronghold. And then beside that we have the modern day Church of Ireland, which was started to be built around 1852 and was finished around 1854 and was definitely on a religious site before that. Also, we're not sure the exact location, but the original Batora Royal was over there as well, probably where the modern day Moat Primary School is. And that was where royal schools were decreed by King James I around 1608. Now, it wasn't then in purpose till about 1618, and it was here till 1661 before it moved to Enniskillen around that St McCartan's Cathedral area. And it was described as being 15 miles from Enniskillen in Ballybalfour, which is one of the original names for Lisnaskea. And then over sort of onto my right here, we have an old routeway going in and out of Lisnaskea up the Castle Balfour Road. And about halfway up that hill there on your right hand side, we have Lisnaskea Fort, the Black Fort. And that would have been in its pomp around medieval Gaelic Ireland. And then as we go on further on, snaking our way on up that hill, and then as we come down, we go towards the very historic Achalacher Church and Graveyard. But where I am here today in this doorway is another very historical site in this area, and that is Lisnaskea Workhouse, the Union Workhouse. And around 1839, George Wilkinson, English architect and designer from around Oxford, was given a commission by the Poor Law Commission to build and oversee 130 union workhouses in Ireland. And they were to be put strategically in different places all over Ireland. There were 3 in County Fermanagh. This one here, which at the moment is the most complete. The second one is in the middle of Fermanagh in Enniskillen, which was recently there refurbished. And the last one then was in Lotherstown, which is now called Irvinstown, which as far as I'm aware has completely disappeared. And if you look at all the workhouses in Ireland, the one thing you'll probably notice about them, well, there's a couple of things, is one is they all are very, very similar. And Wilkinson was obviously a clever enough man, because they paid him £500 commission every year, and he basically done one main drawing and he replicated that all over Ireland. And what's sort of slightly telling about that as well was the Poor Law Commission told him that they were to be done in a Tudor style, imposing and plain. And when you look at the workhouses, you always get that sort of a feel of them. The land here was bought from Lord Erne around 1840 for £336. And this workhouse in particular was to serve 500 people. And it covered a square area of 153 square miles, serving 14 wards or districts of around 34,000 people. Now, if you were unfortunate enough to have to look for relief here at Lisnaskea Workhouse, the chances are you probably felt fairly humble and fairly small. And one of the things you notice when you're standing in this doorway is just the size of it, the proportions of it. And if you had to knock this door, you probably would have felt even smaller. But I suppose the only worst thing then being let through this door, people were turned away from this door. And by the end of the 1840s, 1850, 1851 period, 1 million people had died in Ireland, and 1 million people had disappeared. And by 1855, that number who had emigrated or disappeared had went up to 2 million. So what we have to do now, I suppose, is go back a little bit in history to rationale the reason for union workhouses in Ireland. Workhouses had already been built in England under George Wilkinson, and an act had been passed, the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, by the Whig government. And this is basically denying substance to the poor, denying them outdoor relief, and basically saying to get any sort of relief, indoor relief, you had to enter a workhouse. It was a way of trying to bring stability and order to the country. In England at that time, England and Wales and Scotland. And this was then mirrored in 1838 when the Poor Law Relief Act was brought in. And that basically mirrored that 1834 Act. And that's why the workhouses started to be built in around that 1839, 1840 period in Ireland. And I suppose in some ways it was a form of austerity. And it was based along also on that sort of idea that as the population was increasing, we could no longer manage to give that form of relief. And it was also a way of challenging people, kind of that, you know, that dependency, calling them out, sort of, you know, if you're not fit to work, then you have to go into the workhouse. Now, that Poor Law Relief Act in England was challenged by people, but unfortunately, the classes at that time, the political classes, the middle classes, you know, usually laid people like William Cobbett, radicals, and unfortunately, because Cobbett seen these here workhouses as being basically like a prison, and if you sort of, when you look at this and hear some of the rhetoric around it, it's, you know, inmates, paupers. And as I said earlier, the workhouses were looked to be imposing, but when you went inside them as well, you were usually given a uniform. Sexes were separated, menial work, basic sort of hygiene and living conditions. And so Cobbett wasn't too far wrong in his analysis. And then, of course, in Ireland, we had what some people call, and I use the word great in a strange kind of a way, the Great Famine, which sort of came in around 1845. And that was a European, wider problem. But of course, it hit Ireland more because it was a staple diet. And whenever that the potato blight hit Ireland, because potatoes were the staple diet of Ireland, and they were sort of like a sole food source in a lot of rural areas, it really hit Ireland more than any other country. And it lasted for maybe 5-6 years. There was a long period of that. There had been famines in Ireland before, but they tended to be more because of poor weather, and they tended to be shorter. But of course, in Victorian times, it left people in Ireland and across impoverished. And so not everybody who went in here, and hardly anybody who went in here, went in because they were, you know, lazy or didn't want to work. That was not the reason. And the famine, of course, exacerbated that whole problem. And we see from records here in 1846, for instance, at the start of 1846, when the famine, it had started to really take a hold around the late 1845s. There was 236 people in this workhouse, and that went up by the end of 1846. That had went up till something like 856 people for a workhouse that was to hold 500 people. So all of a sudden, you can see the way it's nearly quadrupled. The stress that that put on the workhouse, money-wise. The guardians then were in major problems in what to do. And the things like, for instance, we see that, for instance, in relation to food, you know, in the early 1840s, people were getting a fairly good sort of diet. I wouldn't say it was brilliant, but they were getting things, they were getting potatoes and stuff like that. And by that time, 1846, they were importing Indian maize, cheap Indian maize, which is basically like gruel. So what we can start to see is the perfect storm. And then what we've got to factor in, which was a major player in this time, was the government's attitude to Ireland, to workhouses, and the economy in general. There was a three-tiered effect there. The first one was the Whig government's attitude was a laissez-faire attitude. Laid back, let it be. Do not involve yourself overly in the mechanisms of the economy. And that's why, unbelievably, you see grain being exported out of Ireland around this time, when there was a lot of suffering going on. Then we had the second tier, was what is referred to as an act of providence. And people like Charles Trevelyan, who was a government administrator responsible for relief in Ireland at that time, he was certainly a proponent of that, where it was an act of God, a sort of based around a religious ideas. And then what we have is what some people now refer to as moralism. And that was basically where it wasn't a financial thing, it was a moral thing. That idea. And that again, Trevelyan promoted that as well. And the upper and middle classes of the political elite in the British government at the time. And that was that idea that the Irish were lazy. They were reckless. Their agrarian system was poor, and in some ways they deserved that. Then just lastly, to cap the whole thing off, and we see it even in modern times, famine fatigue, where after a year or two, people started to become disinterested in what was happening in Ireland. And the British government were, of course, largely responsible for that. But there were people in Ireland who were also responsible. The big Irish landlords, the merchants who kept their grain at a certain price so that the ordinary person couldn't buy it. And that has to be remembered as well. And by the end of the 1840s, 1850, 1851, in County Fermanagh, 40,446 people had disappeared. 25% of the population. So we're here in Lisnaskea Famine Graveyard, and what I have here is extracts from the Lisnaskea Board of Guardians minute books from 1844 to 1851. And these books, this pamphlet, when you're reading it, gives you a little sort of a flavour and a taste for Lisnaskea Workhouse. And I'm going to read you some short extracts just from the minutes from this period. And the first one here is 22nd of March 1845. Ordered that whenever any of the female paupers are employed in the male dormitories for washing the floors or in any other occupation there, by the direction of the master or matron, they should invariably be attended by the matron or one of the officers of the house, and at all other times no communication whatever to be allowed between the male and female paupers. 1845 as well. Resolved that the master of the workhouse be directed to have the quantity of Indian meal required for breakfast to be steeped overnight and the next morning boiled at least an hour and a half, afterwards the oatmeal added and made into a stirabout, and also to have the quantity of Indian meal required for dinner and supper steeped previous to being used and boiled in like manner. Resolved that the clerk be directed to write to the Poor Law Commissioners to require of them, if it would be advisable for the Board of Guardians to freight a small vessel of Indian corn from America for the use of the workhouse. Resolved that the following report of the medical officer in reference to the burying ground be inserted in the minutes for the information of the Poor Law Commissioners. By desire of the Board of Guardians, I have visited the graveyard, a deep quarry allotted for the paupers, and certified that it is not in any way injurious to the health of the inmates of the workhouse, and that the corpses are decently interred with a deep covering of nearly 6 feet of earth. George D. Mansfield, Medical Officer, 23rd of September 1847. Resolved that the relieving officer be empowered to provide coffins for the decent interment of any really destitute person or persons in their respective districts whom they may find have no friends or relatives to provide such coffins, and to be particular in charging the cost of such coffins to the electoral division legally entitled to each cost. This is December 1848. Letter from the Poor Law Commissioner stating that Lieutenant Henry R.N., Emigration Officer, is to proceed to Lisnaskea Union for the inspection and final selection of the female orphans who were proposed for emigration to South Australia. Details of fitting out of the 20 female orphans chosen for emigration to South Australia. The clerk was directed to inquire of Mr. William Noble, agent to the coach company at Lisnaskea, What will be charged for carrying 20 young girls by the day, coach or caravan, from the workhouse to Dublin? And to make arrangements for the girl to start early on Monday morning, the 8th of January 1849. This is 27th of October 1849. The Board of Guardians are desirous to call the attention of the Poor Law Commissioners to the increasing number of applications for admission to the workhouse from unmarried females who are in a state of pregnancy and from prostitute diseased girls as the Guardians apprehend they are. To a certain degree, holding out an encouragement to the prostitution of these females by admitting them into the hospital of the workhouse and in fact making the workhouse into a lying-in hospital. So soon as each lass recovers, they leave the house and don't return till they are in the same state as when formerly admitted. The Guardians also feel the impropriety of allowing these prostitutes to associate with the moral and well-behaved female inmates. Therefore, request the Commissioners will inform them what steps they should take when such persons apply for admission and whether it would be more advisable to reject such applicants altogether. The reply of the Poor Law Commissioners to the stated problem of prostitutes in the workhouse. They think the Guardians could not properly refuse relief to females of bad character. If the applicants be in a state of destitution, also recommending the Guardians to consider whether any arrangement can be made for separating the association of women of notoriously bad character with other females in the workhouse.
A single headstone for those below, a mass grave for the lowly souls, a rusted gate that sees less use, an information stand that tells us facts but not the truth. Fate watched with tears in her eyes as she saw those who emerged from birth only to starve in life and under this earth. This sad plot, this bitter soil, seemed to serve the trees, 13 ewes, the 12 apostles, and the Messiah unseen. Themselves a memorial that grows with time, guarding over the end to the blighted lives. A building of misery that has since been split, abandoned, reused and abused, serving gaunt bodies dressed in wool and tweed, saved from starvation but not disease. A council estate grows yet does not enclose, thanks to the walls that both crumble yet stand, as the children of Lakeview play hopscotch on the path that cuts through the tragic land.
And as we come to the conclusion about Lisnaskea Workhouse, when you research about Lisnaskea Workhouse and workhouses in general and the Victorian times in this period, what you find is that it's an extremely complex story. And so therefore, I do apologise because I do this, I don't read this from a script, and I do apologise for probably the many things that I've left out, I haven't included. But if I probably included everything about the workhouse here and in general, I'd be probably standing here for about 3 hours. And what we've got to remember about Lisnaskea Workhouse is these were different times in the Victorian period. And what you had was two-party system in Britain, in England. You had the Tory party and you had the Whig party. And I suppose in today's terms, they would be seen as being sort of right-wing and right-wing. Because what you've got to remember is the ordinary person couldn't vote back then. You basically had to own land or own property. And in some conditions, some people actually had two votes, believe it or not. And so therefore you can see that for instance, the Whig party, the Whig government at the time, basically got a lot of its votes from the middle classes, the political elite, from rich merchants, rich landowners, and they were never going to overly serve the ordinary person, and in particular if you were poor at the time. The great Victorian writer of the time, and one of the best writers in the English language ever, Charles Dickens, was asked to stand for Parliament on 3 occasions, but he always refused. And he had, before he was an author, he was a journalist. That was one of his roles, and he often went to the law courts and to the Houses of Parliament, and he seen the injustices that were happening at the time. And he thought that by writing about them in his books, he could influence people and the government of the time far more than if he was ever a politician. And of course, he reached the masses of people that weren't normally reached. And he actually had some moderate success in changing some laws, in particularly to magistrate courts. And so, of course, Charles Dickens had some experience of hardship in the Victorian times. When he was around 14, he was sent to a blackening factory. And of course, his father, John Dickens, was in Marshalsea prison, a debtor's prison. And Dickens, in his books, in that book, Oliver Twist, that sort of well-known line of, "Can I have some more?" Although it's a piece of fiction, it's not actually that far from the truth. Now, this short film we're doing here today, for me, is for all the people who have an interest in the workhouse here, who maybe were born in the workhouse, died in the workhouse, lived in the workhouse, worked in the workhouse, or like some of them young girls had to emigrate from the workhouse. This short film is in kind of memory of all those who have some sort of a connection to this workhouse, because what we've got to remember is this is only around about a generation or 2 generations ago, and that's important to remember. And as we see, this building is of great importance historically, socially, and architecturally. And this building is now in the top 10 buildings at risk architecturally in Northern Ireland. I'll let that sit with you for a second. Surrounded on 3 sides by social housing with young children, and then on the other side, the Moat Primary School. It is now actually becoming dangerous. Let down by the political chattering classes, both locally and further afield, by public bodies whose remit is to ensure that this building is in good order, by Fermanagh District Council, who sold this building off into private hands many years ago, not valuing the history and the context of this building. Because surely, if you don't value and respect and understand your past, you will never forge a brighter future.